Hey, Stephen Mirasu, Wine Saves Lives. I've had a really busy week this week, finalizing blends in advance of bottling, tweaking blends that we're going to end up bottling in September. And this is my 30th harvest coming up this year. Where has the time gone? I feel it in every bone, every sinew sometimes when when things are a little difficult, but 99% of the time being in the cellar, in the quiet, in the dark, in the cold is like being in the most welcoming, wonderful personal space that you can be in. The most magical spot, the spot with the most potential. And I've had that luxury this first couple of days of the week. Get a little bit further away from the more fundamentally important pieces of my work, which is the sales piece. But if you don't have wine to sell, then there is nothing, there is no sales piece. So this first few days of the week working with my wife and my son to put together the last bits of wine that we need for later this year and for the first third of next year. A little bit of a cadence there. It doesn't always work, and we don't have a monopoly on wisdom to be certain. But what we do tends to work for us. And when I get an opportunity to be in the cellar and focusing on specific barrels and focusing on groups of barrels and focusing on what what makes for a complete wine, what makes for a beautiful wine, what makes for a wine that performs the most fundamental task, which is to make people happy. It's an incredibly enlivening experience. It really is what keeps the fire stoked. Working on some Cab Franc blends and working, and this is a story, I suppose, about being constantly resurprised about decisions we've made in the past and how they have been born from a lot of experience, a lot of trial and error, and have tended to work out pretty well. Aging Cabernet Franc in used puncheons, 500-liter barrels. So imagine a regular wine barrel. It's called a barrique in French. It's 225 liters, let's say. Depending upon whether it's a Bordeaux shape or a Burgundy shape, it's 225 liters or 228 liters. A puncheon is a 500-liter barrel, so it's a little over two times the size of a barrique. The larger the vessel, the more wine there is per square inch of wood on the inside of the barrels. The ratio of wood to wine is smaller the larger the vessel, so that you get less and less extraction of wood in the larger vessel. The smaller the barrel, and we've made the mistake in the past of putting, for certain tastings and the like, putting wine in a really small barrel, like a 2-gallon barrel or a 3-gallon barrel, and the wine is over oaked in 36 seconds. So the larger format barrels tend to give us exactly what we need, which is that sort of micro oxygenation that helps to round out the edges of the wine without adding wood flavor and wood aroma, which for us is taboo, antithetical to the beauty of Cabernet Franc. So we have a fair number of puncheons, used puncheons in the cellar. We have a lot of used barrique and really old barrels that are seventh or eighth use or ninth use or what have you. So about as neutral as a barrel can be. And I had the opportunity earlier this week to taste through a lot of Cab Franc, a lot being not a lot, not in terms of overall volume, but a lot from a specific place, Gilmedi Vineyard in this case. And we had wines that are aging in barrique and wines that are aging in puncheon, and had the opportunity of evaluating these wines barrel by barrel, container by container. The way that I do it, I grab a thief, I put the thief in the barrel, I grab some wine in my glass, I have my notebook with me, I write notes about how the wine smells. how much wood is there? How prevalent is the fruit? Is there anything weird going on? And then I could put a couple of slashes in my notebook. And after that, it's all about the way the wine tastes and feels. And so I have two separate notes, or it makes one note, two separate things about the wine that I'm interested in. There's generally more about the taste and the texture part of it than there is about the smell part of it. When you're working in a cold cellar that's at 55 degrees, the wines, it takes some time to get used to extrapolating all the nuances from what you're tasting. If you're in a room temperature, if you're in a restaurant at 68 degrees, the wines are warmer. There's more aromatic energy there. You're smelling more. The wines are smelling and tasting more forward. In the cellar, you have to make allowances for the fact that it doesn't really do that in that environment. But I've gotten used to it. It's been a number of, I don't know how many thousands of barrels of wine I've tasted over the years. And so I'm writing notes about these wines, the overall quality of the 24 and 23 vintage in this case, 23 vintage of Cabernet Franc is extraordinary. It's going to be an amazing vintage for Livermore Valley, at least for our wines. 22, we're releasing the 22 vintage wines now, and those wines are certainly of a time that's going to be interesting to see. 2012 for us was a very Labrador Retriever vintage, very friendly, the fruit came out of its glass and licked your face like it was your best friend. Similar to 22. They were both warmish years, 22 much more warmer than 12. And I think the fact that 22 was so warm, we had a heat dome over California over Labor Day weekend that lasted about 8 days, and the temperatures were in 108 to 112 for days after day. That affected the overall relationship between fruit and the structure of the wine. Talk more about that down the road. But 23, beautiful. Cooler year, much more structure, much more length, much more mystery. And it was really interesting to see how different the wines, same exact wine, coming from a neutral barrel compared to the wine coming from the neutral puncheon. There was a heft, a depth of structure, a mouthfeel to the barrel aged wine that was very different than what you got in puncheon. The puncheon wines were significantly longer in the mouth, it seemed to me. It took a while for those wines to unfold in the mouth. The fruit tended to be slightly more prevalent, slightly more acid driven in the puncheon than they were in the barrique, which was interesting to me. There was a kind of a beautiful combination, I think, of things is the way it'll end up working when we actually finalize the blends, where you get a piece that gives you more volume from a feeling standpoint in the mouth, coupled with wines that are pacey, wines that have an acid drive to them, wines that, if your mouth is a river and or is the bed of the river, let's call it, and it's moving quickly through your mouth. To me, that signifies a lot of acidity. If the river has a lot of rocks in it, that tends to define or describe wines with a lot of tannin. There can be a breadth to the tannin and the expression of that structural piece in your mouth that is definitely shaped by certain coopers in a way. Taranso barrels, which we love, tend to present, at least in the first year, a much redder fruit quality, but a much more circumscribed tannin quality, which we love. They tend to revert more to the darker fruit that we'd expect in any given variety in year two, but they tend to really beautifully maximize the tannin aspect of our wines without contributing the kind of oaky flavor and aroma that we get from a Francois Frere barrel, for instance, especially a new one. So it was when I'm by myself and I'm tasting in this fashion, it reveals this exercise reveals so much about my relationship to wine, reveals so much about my relationship to my work, my relationship to Livermore Valley, my home. And it's a way of getting back in touch with what is so emotionally evocative about wine. I get an opportunity to forget about cash flow and forget about what might be happening in the larger world, at least for a little while. And I get to immerse myself in this world that is about the senses, this world that is a sensory driven place. It's my kind of over the rainbow moment. I open the door to my little shack and there's this beautiful cellar open to me with every potentiality that can be imagined. And it's an extraordinarily beautiful thing I will never, ever take for granted. These wines from 23 will be released toward the end of 2025 and into 2026. I'm excited about talking about the individual wines as we go down the road here, but I think in a general way, as just a general kind of observation about things, the wines are doing what they're supposed to do. And I'm very excited about what they will be when they're on the next step of their journey, actually in a bottle and being a symbol of and a potential for every bit of magic. Stephen Mirasu, Wine Saves Lives. Talk to you soon.